All right, so we're going to be starting the online lecture with our very first detailed region that we're going to be looking at, breaking up these individual regions um, into something that's a little bit more kind of attainable for us to understand because, especially into the Pacific period, change is occurring at many different rates in many different places. And so we're going to look at what that change looks like over time, especially within these specific regions. So we're looking at the Northwest Coast today, and here is the Northwest Coast. Geographically, stretches from the Bodega Bay to the Oregon border, and then goes from the Pacific Coast to the eastern slopes of the northern and Klamath Mountain ranges. So that kind of moves from east to west. So, as you would expect, it's a pretty large area, and so there is some distinction from the coast groups to the inland groups. But yeah, so we'll talk about what makes this area so very special. Environmentally, um, as you can imagine, if anybody's ever taken a drive up there, things change very dramatically. Um, I used to live up in Humboldt, and we were on the coast, constant fog in the redwood forest, and then you drive a half an hour inland, and it's 85 degrees and sunny. So you know, kind of similar changes that we see, kind of what we're used to here in the Bay Area. So it really depends on the elevation, the latitude, distance to the coast. All of these things dramatically change the environment, the climate, and the resources that are available to you. So this affects the hydrology, this affects the vegetation, and of course the subsistence. The food sources that these groups are utilizing. So some of the major zones in the Northwest. There are four major zones. We have the coastal mountain region, dominated by the redwood forests. Um, in the northern counties, there are mixed evergreens, montane forests, and fir Sitka spruce. So really heavy fir forests, evergreen forests. In the southern counties, you have a mix of conifers, hardwoods, chaparral, some valley oak savanna. So definitely an area where you might find a little bit more, acorns in this area. And then, of course, along the coast itself, lagoons, estuaries, offshore islands, coastal prairies. Each of these, has a very distinct type of resource available to it. And that's what we see certain groups, especially into the Pacific period, like we talked about, focusing on certain subsistence strategies. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. One thing that we haven't talked about specifically is what these societies, what these cultures looked like at times of historic contact. So this is just going to give you an idea of how very diverse, culturally and ethnically diverse, these California was, linguistically diverse. I mean, each of these areas very, very different. Linguistically, that's probably our closest guide as to understand these groups by the language that they spoke at the time of contact with Europeans. So very unique area for cultural development. This is one of the most diverse linguistic traditions that we find in California. There are 20 distinct languages representing 5 language families present at contact. So again, when looking at the coastal area, very, very kind of different um, as far as the types of languages that are being spoken. And in many ways, language kind of, in some essence, informs culture too. Language is, again, it's a form of kind of identity creation. So we definitely have linguistic barriers spoken by certain groups here. Um, in general, we can break up the Northwest Coast culturally, linguistically, into two major groups. the Northwest Coast Group, and the California Culture Area. So even talking about this larger region, we see some major distinctions. So we're going to talk a little bit more about these two groups, the Northwest Coast Group and the California Culture Area. The Northwest Coast Group it's a much longer area. Again, a lot of times we kind of, our modern day boundaries throw us off a little bit. But if we picture no boundaries, the Northwest Coast Group goes pretty far up. Regionally, it spreads from Alaska and Canada down to Cape Mendocino. The groups here represented are the Tolowa, the Yurok, the Wiyut, the Karok, and the Hupa. And this is what is seen as the southernmost peripheral expression of this Northwest, major Northwest culture that I'm sure many of you have heard of. When you think Northwest culture, a lot of people think totem poles, they think these the longhouses, they think potlatches. Early on, studied a lot, and a lot recorded from these groups by the Russians, by U.S. Ethnographers, by archaeologists. So this is a very interesting area, and we see in California, these are especially prominent in areas like Vancouver, Seattle, all the way up into Alaska. But they did have quite a large cultural expression in the northwestern section of California as well. A lot of the images that I show now are taken from anthropologists or ethnographers or explorers or travelers, to give us a sense of what these people looked like, what their technology looked like, to get a better understanding of their everyday life, what their subsistence looked like, what their family units looked like, how they lived, to really understand, this period during contact, the historic period. It's tragic because we're talking about the genocide, and of course, the cultural genocide and the real genocide of these indigenous groups. But in many cases, this is the earliest salvaging of these traditional ways, of the cultures, of the religions and rituals and languages, and so we see this in the photographs. We see that the ways they used to live. This is up in Crescent City, a basket weaver, and so very, very important to view these photos, to see who these people were, and to kind of carry through our understanding, and kind of think even further back archaeologically as to how amazing some of these cultures were, how magnificent some of the societies were, their settlements, their economies, and really how complex they were. I think that's one of the major things that I really try to put forward in my courses, when dealing with anthropology and archaeology, is that there's this large stigma when dealing with native groups. And this was rhetoric that was reinforced in the 1700s and the 1800s into the 1900s, even till today. You hear some of these horribly derogatory terms like savage and inferior and things like that. And this was done very purposely, as a way that white culture and Europeans would take away the lands of these people and subjugate them. And so, I really think that by looking archaeologically, we can get a much better sense. We can break down these barriers. We can break down these stigmas and these misnomers that have kind of plagued our history, and really try to understand truly who these people were. And so hopefully we can get a sense of this both through the archaeology as well as through the historical record. In general, the Northwest Coast Group lived in high densities along the coast, and to some extent these interior riverine niches. So they would locate themselves along these very vast ranging river networks that would eventually flow out into the ocean. Their focal economy was focused on acorns, river fishing, and deep sea fishing. Again, rivers if they're located on the interior, deep sea if they're located on the coast. They used canoes, they used fish dams, deep sea nets for acquisition, and smokehouses for processing. So salmon was definitely a very, very, very important aspect of these societies, and we see this is still the case all the way from Alaska down the coast. Salmon is the lifeblood of many of these modern day subsistence strategies for these indigenous native groups as well. Early on, there was a universal concept of private property, which isn't something that we see. At least it's not as prevalent. And so, in the Northwest, there individuals and families owned important resources and resource areas. They used pooled labor through immediate family, and then they could accumulate food and resources as surplus, which we've talked about before. This is differential access to wealth. Certain individuals, certain families have certain access to resources. They own certain resources. And, when one family has access to the better resources, they, of course, have access to a surplus. They can sustain a larger family unit. The larger the family, the more labor that's pooled. And that's how gaps in wealth occur. And so this then creates differential wealth and power structures, which of course leads to social complexity and social classes. You have the haves, you have the people in the middle, and then the have-nots, kind of the commoners. So again, this is where we start seeing this concept of a chiefdom emerge. There is this concept, and we haven't really talked about it yet. We'll talk about it with the San Francisco Bay lecture. But the tribelet unit wasn't in use here. They were organized by family unit. So they weren't necessarily organized by these tribelets, and we'll talk about what these tribelets were, but precedence was given to the individual or the immediate family. So that's the Northwest Coast Group. There's also the California Culture Area. Now, this includes most of the southern Northwest Coast areas. So, if we were to split the Northwest region into two groups, the one to the further north and the one a little bit further south, the southern area is the California Culture Area. These include most southern groups, the Athabascan, the Yuki, the Miwok, the Wapo, and the Pomoan groups. And there's, again, you can see some of these to the south, a little bit more prominent. They typically, whereas the Northwest Coast group exhibited features that we see further north up into Canada, modern day Alaska, the California Culture Area a little bit further south, they represented, cultural distinctions and characteristics that were similar to the rest of the California groups. So, a little bit different from their neighbors to the north. Not necessarily longhouses, but had more of these kind of plank types or the thatched hut type habitation structures. And their characteristics, their focal economy, didn't rely on maritime or riverine resources as much. They mostly focused on terrestrial resources. Acorns, very, very important for them. They also hunted, used hard seeds, and shellfish as well. So they had more resources than the northern groups, which meant that they weren't as sedentary. They didn't have to necessarily focus too much on that focal economy because, again, those northern groups were so invested in especially fishing and salmon fishing and coastal fishing. But the more resources, they had to move a little bit more. You see a little bit more seasonal movement in the California culture area groups. So to the north, they were a little bit more sedentary. Organization-wise, they are based on the tribelet organization with a chief. Their settlement was organized around a village center. So these were kind of multiple family dwellings, and they had a central dance house and a chiefly house. So very much still this kind of chiefdom type society, where you have the chief and his family kind of occupying that highest social class, and then everybody else. And they did move seasonally to gather resources. They lived on stored food in the winter, and in the spring and summer they saw not everybody, but certain specialized groups moved into mountain regions to gather and collect. So not the entire society didn't uproot, but only smaller groups went out, branched off of this main group, collected, and then brought stuff back. So a very interesting kind of settlement and migration pattern dynamic that we see. The regional chronology that we see, the author describes patterns in the same way that we have discussed traditions in the past. So this is coming from the Jones and Clark text. So like we had the Windmiller tradition, and the Borax Lake tradition. The patterns, like you see there, the post pattern, the Borax Lake pattern, very similar to traditions. It's kind of defined by common artifacts, and common kind of subsistence and technology and cultural features. So the very earliest type of pattern that we see existed from that Pleistocene to Holocene transition, so from the Paleo period to the Archaic. And this is where we see fluted points not being associated with faunal remains, and the kind of basic hunter-gatherer paleo culture. Moving from into the early Holocene or the early Archaic period, this is where we see the Borax Lake pattern, which we've talked a little bit about before. This is where we see the first shift in technology and subsistence. This is when plant processing and milling tools are first found. So this is important because we see a shift in subsistence when we see new groundstone. And then the early Berkeley pattern, we see formalized burials in extended positions, and this is the beginning of acorn processing. So as early as the early Archaic, they are beginning acorn processing, which is pretty important. And then as we move down through time, we have the Middle Holocene, so the Middle Archaic period, the Mendocino pattern, mostly seasonal temporary hunting camps early on. And this is the argument archaeologists have made, that we see sedentism coupled with acorn salmon subsistence strategy first here. So pretty early on are we seeing early kind of sedentary lifestyle. As we move further into the kind of late Archaic period and into the Pacific period, we see much higher degrees of sedentism into the Berkeley pattern. The focal economy now, so we had a diffuse economy, we see it switch to acorn, fishing, and hunting. Basketry is more kind of varied in its style, and we see a lot of exchange and trade occurring. The Gunther pattern, as we get well into kind of the Middle Pacific period, high degrees of sedentism. You see very permanent and large structures, impressive artistic traditions. We see a lot of craft economy flourishing in this area. Stylized lithics, zooform clubs, steatite bowls, large obsidian blades. So the craft economy is booming, and you can definitely tell that they are, using this trade network to move goods, and the kind of the top, the chiefly class and his family, they are definitely gaining wealth through this trade. And then the Augustine pattern from AD 500 on into the middle to later Pacific period. We see sedentism, large-scale ceremonial complexes associated with artifacts such as steatite pipes, shell discs, and ornaments. There is a greater degree of socioeconomic variability. So we see there's a larger gap between these social classes, and we see ritual play an important role. And so very kind of important as we see again this kind of domino effect that we've talked about, right? So, you have sedentism, and then from sedentism, they focus on this. They have the focal economy, which can support and requires a rather relatively larger population with cooperative and specialized labor, and populations continue to grow, and with that, you see complex society emerge, and of course, with this is the the complexity of social classes and wealth, and the economy and things like that. So the last slide is just going to leave us with some questions, some key research questions going forward that archaeologists have asked. Do we see intense coastal use of maritime resources post-dating 1000 BC? So is this something, when did this happen? When did they really start using maritime resources? And then two, when did the acorn salmon subsistence strategy start? Did the focal economy come much earlier? Was it at 1500 BC, like some people say? Or was it after AD 500? This is typically, this is into the Pacific period when most groups have adopted that focal economy that we've talked about, where they just focus on a couple key staple resources. So did it come much earlier, or was it kind of around the time that everybody else adopted that type of subsistence strategy? That's what the focus is here for archaeologists going forward, is to see, how exactly were these groups, adapting to their environment, and how did this structure their society? All right, so that is the lecture on the Northwest Coast groups. Let me know if you have any questions. So again, this is in place of lecture this Friday, and I will see everybody on Wednesday, October 18th, regularly scheduled class and time. Thanks.